no guaranteed entry to an international event. Players risk their lives for extraordinary rewards. Two legends born to break down and analyze the greatest gameplay you've ever seen. Opinions with no boundaries. Passion with no...
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the Matchfix. I'm Shok, the detective of this, the fresh prince of PCS, and I'm joined by the showered and dressed, but also sleep-deprived and stressed, emelg.
I'm emelg. We've just come out of the final week of the round robins, and yeah, it was a week. A lot of upsets, and I think a lot of stuff that people weren't expecting. Potentially one of those results was the PGG versus Direwolves match.
Direwolves hard outdrafted PGG, or rather I think PGG might have outdrafted themselves, because like what happened basically was the Direwolves took Talia on 3 on red side, which is I think a pretty decent champ to pick into what has been shown so far. I think it was like the Tristana and the Rel, so there was like good stuff there. And then PGG in the 4-5 for whatever reason take Silas and Renekton, which I feel like are both pretty awful in this game. So I'm not sure why we picked those. I guess like the reason was that, I don't know, Dongi has had, I would say, its biggest weakness so far has been champion pool, so maybe his options are already pretty restricted. And then I think the Renekton, I mean, it is the best blind top. I think it was a blind from what I remember. But yeah, anyway, I don't really like it. And then it was weird because, okay, I think when you look at these comps, the only way in my mind that PGG should win this is they really have to get ahead early. They have like a lot of lane priority. And I think it was like, yeah, it's up to Talia to kind of like neutralize this early game while both the side lanes push. And what ended up happening was basically nothing happened in early game. So then I was like, okay, Direwolves have got this. They've got the far easy to execute composition. They've gotten through that tough early game. And now they're just going to, collect their free win. But what instead happened is that PGG just outplayed Direwolves pretty much every fight. Yeah. There was a lot of inting from Direwolves' game. In fact, there was this one team fight very early in the game where like, I think Lucian flashes and gets Talia walled, like stuck in a corner, and then Nami is forced to flash over the Talia wall. It was just really, really poorly played from Direwolves, and I think that kind of sums up the game as a whole, that PGG, they just kind of played a bit better than them.
It does feel like Direwolves really should have been able to come out ahead. Like, I mean, spoilers for later on, but I mean, Daystar plays like against a very similar team comp where, it's like very melee, very, dive heavy. PGG drafted pretty much 5 dive champs, so you'd expect that Talia would have like a really easy time dealing with that, but it just didn't happen.
I think that Talia did okay. I just feel like Direwolves as a whole didn't do that well, right? Like it felt like Praedyth was picked off a lot. There was just like a lot of random deaths kind of across the team. So I'm not sure if I'd just put it on Chaz, because I think Chaz actually had a fine game, but it was just, as a whole, they didn't quite play as well as they could. And there were some pretty incredible moments in there from Violet. Also, Appy on the Rel put up a pretty big performance, so yeah, bit of a bot div. Our second game actually saw Chiefs being taken out by Peace in their first, technically first game. First time we've seen their roster anyway, and it was pretty interesting because in the pre-game interview, Bio actually said that he thought Peace were, I think he said top 2, or he said like, pretty high up based on their scrims.
I've always rated Peace as super high. Like, I feel like they're second or third. We should not doubt them as like opponents. I versed them in scrims. I just think they're really good.
Well, I mean, Peace started off with the Varus first pick, as we've sort of seen come to fruition in this patch. And I think the rest of the draft, there wasn't really too much surprising there. He had Raze opting for Sivir. Makes sense for Raze. He's kind of just not really playing for lane, playing for the late game team fights, being that insurance for Chiefs, right? It's very standard for them. And Casey on the 5P Cassim as well. We've seen him do well in that. I think what was interesting was the wager picking the Camille, because there's already been sort of talked about him being, quite a mechanical top lane, preferring the carry tops, which is, makes for an interesting matchup into Biopanther, because he's usually more of the tank player, more of the, I want to play for the team. I'm going to be this 1v9 machine in the team fights. And I think I've heard Biopanther say as well that he actually likes the Sion versus Camille matchup a lot. So Peace picking Camille into Sion should have been good for him as well. But going into the game, it really does feel like Chiefs were just outclassed in most stages of the game. It didn't feel like one of those, like a lot of the other games we had this week, where it was like very messy, lots of kills going around, lots of sort of throwing back and forth. It did feel like quite measured gameplay, and Like, it wasn't really a surprising result to me once we saw the game get going.
Okay. I think it was like a little closer than you give it credit for.
Oh, no, it was close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember there was like some really, really sick team fights. Like, I actually thought overall the level of play during the team fights was pretty high.
Yeah.
I think that like bot fight in the jungle, like where Kize was going in and out, I think it was executed by like, pretty well by everyone in there. So it's a pretty exciting game. I'm actually not too sure like what I'd give as like the reason for the loss. I think it's like you said, like Peace just seemed to play like a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly.
Overall. But yeah, it's like real exciting to see, right? Because we've always kind of had, those 2 or 3 contenders, right? And nothing more than that. And now Peace kind of come out of the gate swinging, looking pretty strong. And we'll talk about the standings and seeding a bit later because there's definitely some interesting discussion around that. But I'm also really happy for Cheon, right? Because he's had a rough go of it. I feel like for most of his career, he's kind of been subbed or, I remember last year, he got that period, I think, where Violet like benched himself and then like him and Gunkrab were doing really well and then it like ended up swapping again. So I don't know. He's had a bit of a rough go of it. And I thought, this year when Peace weren't in, we're just 0-5 and not having a roster, it seemed like I was like, wow, this guy, I feel bad for him. But no, he's on a good team now.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like he's spent a lot of his time sort of like in Violet's shadow, like for, I don't know, it might be recency bias, but for at least like the past couple of years, right? So it is good to see him actually like being able to play a match for starters, but also, actually being able to perform pretty well against what many picked to be the top team of the league. Next up, Day 2, Match 2. PGG versus Bliss. Yet another upset.
Yeah, so this game, I feel like, is the first time I've really felt the effects of Daystar. I think so far I would say he's like never been the reason his team's losing, I don't think, but he hasn't really had the impact you expect kind of like a Korean import to have, right?
Our opponents in Bliss have not been team fighting well.
No.
That is probably the point they need to work on the most.
I think this game was a pretty big mid difference. Admittedly, it was a very good game for Talia, right? Like, it was against a lot of short range champions and Talia gets a lot of value. There's not a whole lot of threat onto her. And I actually think something that I've started to kind of call into question is Dongi's champion pool. Because the thing is, with the champs he's played so far, I believe it's like, in this game he played Set, but he's played Set, Ari, Rumble, and Silas, I think. And of those, the only one that's really like bordering on meta is the Silas. And even that is more of like an answer to stuff. And he picked it into Talia, which that was in a different game we talked about. It was not really the best pick, right? And I think when you're talking about champion pool, especially in OCE, I am a big fan of choosing what you're good at, right? And admittedly, I think Dongi has played fairly well on the champions he's played, right? Despite them not being meta. But I think the reality is, if you're not playing what's meta, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage. And I'm not sure if Dongi should be playing what is meta, but unless the meta turns in kind of like in their favor, I think PGG are always going to have to kind of play from at least not so much a deficit mid lane, but just not getting as much out of mid lane as they'd like. So it's maybe something they have to consider, whether or not they want to just like hard commit to Dongi playing, whatever champs he wants and try and kind of adapt around it, or do they want to kind of spend him time learning a lot of those like more like control mage-esque champions that are kind of better at the moment. I'm not sure what's best, but I think it's just like a point of criticism that at some point something needs to be done about.
Don't know. I never really considered Dongi to be someone that suffers from champion pool issues, but I definitely did sort of feel the effects of his pick this game, right? Because it feels like when you're blind picking Set mid, and you're not really setting up for the pick that well, like the Talia pick was just perfect, right? It slotted in really well with what Team Bliss wanted to go for. And as you said, it's very easy to play into a very short range team. So yeah, it kind of feels like they were trying to just try some stuff again and it didn't work again. Meanwhile, on the side of Bliss, they picked Rengar, first or second pick, into when PGG had only showed the Elise. I thought that was interesting. It might just be why not, being who he is.
Yeah.
But I think it actually made a lot of sense, right? Because you've got champions like, Elise and likely the Varus that PGG are going to pick, right? And I think having that Rengar who can sort of actually act as sort of like a pseudo frontline, because he takes the CC, but then he's able to restore half his HP because his abilities are bullshit, and cleanse himself. I think that's actually really valuable. And plus we saw multiple times in that game where Rengar's ult was actually used like quite effectively to like face check as well. Merits to the Rengar pick, not so many for the Set pick. But the game itself unfolded. I'm trying to not use the word interesting, but it was interesting.
Unusually.
It was quite unusual because PGG, they got a lead for pretty much, I want to say the first half of the game. Although in that time, Bliss was still stacking with Dragons. They had 3-0 at one point. And then the big sort of turnaround point was the Baron fight. PGG, they end up losing a few members, and then Bliss go to the Baron. It's only Violet and Shenfire alive, but they actually managed to play out the 2v5 round Baron very well, spacing around Bliss and kind of cleaning all of them up. Although the key point there is that Bliss actually do manage to still secure the Baron, so they don't actually end up that much behind in gold from that. It feels like more of a trade almost, and it also means that PGG, they don't have the Baron, right? So it kind of slows down the game a little bit through that as well. It gives them more time to look towards that next dragon. And then eventually Bliss pick up the Ocean Soul, and at this point it feels like PGG, they don't really have any ways to win the game because Chippy's on the Jax, he's not really having much of an impact throughout the game, whereas Lived is on Ornn. That's Ornn, it automatically has impact the later game you reach. And ultimately Bliss they just win from there. They pick up the Ocean Soul, they have Daystar, who's pretty much untouchable in all these fights, and it's just theirs.
Yeah, they did have a very simple to execute comp, which I think is very valuable for OCE. Just pick some tanks, pick a strong backline DPS, and just call it a day. I think is pretty strong, especially if you engage in there as well. I'm a pretty big fan of the Bliss comp. I'm still not really sold on the Rengar, to be honest.
It's an interesting one. It does feel like one of those ones where potentially you could pick someone else, and it feels like more like an element of maybe the other team won't know how to play into it. It's sort of like that kind of factor, I guess. I don't know what else would you pick there though, because I can't think of many champions that kind of offer sort of unique.
Yeah, I don't really remember
set.
what was in the pick and ban. I just don't really feel like Rengar was super impactful. I think it could have been any other champ, and it's the same. So
just a why not hater.
No, I'm just a tank Rengar hater. But anyway, I think one real interesting choice is kind of around the dragons, because one thing that I think I've even said this before is I think that the first two dragons are mostly useless, because I think that dragons in 1 and 2 is just giving you the stacking resist or stats or whatever you're getting, and it's the third dragon that is starting to become important because it threatens the fourth one, and obviously the fourth one gives you soul, right? And I think what should happen is that you should be willing, you don't have to, if you can get them, they're good. But you can be willing to give up those first two in order to trade gold for it. If you can get heralds, if you can get towers, if you can trade waves, if you can dive the other side, that should all be worth it. But I think what we're seeing so far in LCO, and admittedly, this is probably because it's early days and the teams aren't that developed yet, is that even the very good teams aren't clean enough at the moment that they won't make mistakes throughout the game. And so what happens is when you should give up those first two dragons and then get the rest of them because you're stronger, what's actually happening is you give up the first two dragons, even though you're stronger, you end up fumbling at some point, the enemy gets another dragon, and then you only have one more mistake left in you, right? Because once they get the soul, it's such a difficult win condition to kind of compete against. So I think that's something that will just naturally go away as the teams get better. But at the same time, scrim's the way you should actually practice getting better, right? And I feel on stage is where you need to be caring about winning the most. And I think at least early in the split, teams should probably have a bit of a higher focus on dragons, just because right now it's just an easy kind of safety mechanism. It allows you to make a few extra mistakes.
Yeah, it does feel like it's sort of a trade-off where, you're either going for the gold route where it's sort of the onus is on you to sort of help accelerate that lead even further. Whereas dragons is less on you and more just, hoping that the other team makes a mistake, because then your win con is already there. So yeah, I do agree that dragons are generally just the safer route for now, right? Because teams just kind of suck.
And last, but certainly not least, emelg, Chiefs versus Kanga. I'd say one of the biggest upsets of the split.
Probably.
Maybe the best.
I think it
depends if you count Peace being 0-5, which we shouldn't really, right? Okay, so biggest upset of the split, I think. Kanga, the last place team, and at that time, I think, if you don't count Peace. And also, before this, Kanga have not picked up a win other than the forfeit, right? So effectively just 0 wins. And they managed to take out the Chiefs, who are, pretty strong team and defending champions. Wow, I mean, the whole game was interesting. I mean, what do you say?
I mean, I think there were already more good signs for them from the draft, because in the previous weeks we'd see them draft very late game oriented, very difficult to execute comps, where sort of it only really works if each player executes it perfectly, right? And that's ultimately not what happened. But this time, it was just a lot easier. You know, they had Hooper, Shinki, and Lushinami, you know, very simple as what it does. It just does damage early game, wins lane, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, Blue and Fiora. And I think the Amumu formation was a bit interesting, but I mean, it is just like overall an easy champion to play, right? So I feel like the sort of bar for execution was a lot lower in this game, and that definitely helped them just, I guess, like decrease the overall mental load. I don't know. Maybe I'm psychoanalyzing this a bit too much, but
yeah, no, I can agree with that. I think also another big part of the draft for me was the fact that what's his name? Fido? I was gonna say Bedoing, but Fido is on something early that can actually push, right? Like it's not the other champs he's been playing where you just like don't want to fight, like don't want to skirmish, don't really push for a lot of the early game. So he got something that can actually, you know, impact the early skirmishes, move around the map and stuff like that, which I think is really nice. It was also really smart by Chiefs in my mind just to take the Azir because like one, that gets rid of it from Fido, and also it's really good against most other majors. So it was a really nice pick just to take away. I think Ryze is at least early game actually fine versus Azir, but later on, like due to the range difference, is pretty annoying. However, the early game didn't end up really happening because Kanga sort of had a disaster at level 1 where Fido, I think he burns Flash and still dies. And then very soon after that, he actually gets like level 3 ganked by Elise and dies again. So he just starts at a really, really big deficit. But there was actually something interesting that I saw on Twitter, which was that Chiefs didn't realize that Ryze had Cosmic Insight because it showed on his TP that it was the normal cooldown. So they didn't realize that his flash was actually shorter cooldown. So what happened is like at around 5 minutes, Chiefs go to gank mid, expecting that Ryze's flash is still down. And they flash in him, but he actually has flash up and he flashes out. And what that happens, I think it leads to Babip and Aladoric both dying. And I think that really turned that early game from being just like completely doomed to actually pretty decent for Kanga.
yeah, and that's kind of where the rest of the normal stuff in the game sort of ended, right? Because it really did feel like the game devolved into just chaos. And it was very back and forth, a lot of fighting, a lot of kills. Like it feels like, maybe this is a bit too harsh. It probably is, but like if you took the team names off and the nameplates off, like I would think it was like maybe like Gravitas Mammoth playing if they were like playing better individually, right? Because it was just like it felt very messy for the rest of the game. And it was a long game as well. Like it went like over 40 minutes, I think. And this is like typically not what you want to see from Chiefs, right? Because we've sort of, or maybe we force this identity on them, but I feel like they fit it pretty well, where they are the team that, you know, will play relatively safe early game, mid game, wait for you to make a mistake and then win from there. But it feels like there were just mistakes from both teams a lot throughout the early mid game, and even into the late game, it was just crazy.
Yeah, I will say that I think that it's pretty normal for teams to look much like, I don't know, less clean, dirtier if they're against 1-3-1 comps, because it's a comp you don't verse very often, and it's also a comp that people don't practice very often. So when you're kind of getting pulled all around the map, I think it's just like, you know, if you execute a 5v5 at Dragon, how many times have teams done that? Like hundreds, thousands of times, right? But if it's like a 1-3-1 comp, sometimes you're putting 2 people in the side lane, you know, where Ryze and Fiora are in the same lane. Sometimes they're on both sides. You've got Ryze like ulting to different waves. It's a lot of scenarios that don't come up very often. And I think just that naturally leads to more mistakes, right? That you wouldn't normally see out of the teams. So yeah, obviously, like you said, it was not a very clean game. At the same time, I sort of understand it. And also, I think Kise really tried his hardest to drag his team to victory. Unfortunately, they did not want to be dragged to victory. They ended up losing, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's obviously like a very big win for Kanga, not just for the standings, but I guess it's like in terms of overall morale, right? Because you don't want to go into the group stages or stage 2 or whatever it's called without a win, because that just sucked. And I think to have that against Chiefs as well, it's a big boost. And I think also it's really important to shout out both Rusty and Hooper, because Rusty, you know, he said something really insightful on broadcast.
I feel like it's this conversation that I very rarely have to have with pro players, because most of them have big egos, which is valid because they should, because they're playing professionally. Yeah, it's a competition.
Yeah.
But it is so important to remember that winning should be celebrated. Like, it's not as simple as saying I won, but I played bad. Let's focus on how bad I played. If you forget that you won, you stop having fun.
Hooper in his interview, you know, he was just like, you know, apologizing, saying like he didn't seem very happy at all, right?
After the win, I feel like I played pretty bad. I do feel happy, but no, I make the game harder.
And ultimately, sure, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. That's for him to decide, right? But you still got it. It's a big win. You gotta be happy about that.
It's controversial opinion is what I'll say. I'm more in the camp of putting yourself down and making sure you have no happiness in life. So
How's that working out for you?
I'm not a pro player anymore.
That's all the matches for our LCO recap. Let's throw it over to our Matchfix bestie, Diamond Peak, but currently Gold 1 18 LP, mid lane main Larissa.
Hey everyone, I'm Larissa and welcome to our featured LCO Fight of the Week. We're looking at the Pentanet.gg vs Direwolves match from day one. At this point in the game, PGG have picked up 4 Drakes and the Elder is about to spawn. Despite this, Direwolves are 200 gold ahead, making the game state extremely close. Let's get into it. Poltron, trying to bait PGG out of vision, fakes the clearing of a control ward. He then moves into engage.
Oh, Poltron jumps in!
Praedyth is quick to follow up, and knowing that Schoenfire has no flash, moves to eliminate him. Schoenfire's dash isn't quite long enough to clear the terrain, but it does force Praedyth to burn his relentless pursuit, allowing Chippy's an opportunity to counter-engage.
A flash done!
Praedyth gets pinned down by Chippy's big croc, and the play is followed up with damage from Violet's Tristana. Apion Rao locks 3 of the Direwolves in place, and Dongy, stealing the Na ultimate, throws him against the wall. Zoranus manages to transform and use his Na ult in an attempt to disengage, but Dongy's tenacity quickly frees him and he takes down Chaz. Violet flashes the wall to correct his positioning and the fight becomes 4 against 3. With the damage carries of Direwolves down, Chippies and the rest of PGG make light work of the remaining players. Zoranus can only salvage what's left on the map as Pentanet take Albert and eventually the game.
And no matter how much of a hero Zoranus is, the rest of his team was already gone.
That's it for our featured LCO Fight of the Week. See you in Stage 2.
With week 1 finishing, that means that stage 1 of the LCO has come to an end and we're moving into stage 2 in a few weeks. Looking at the bracket coming up, we've got Direwolves versus Peace, a very controversial one, which we'll talk about soon, in Group A, as well as PGG versus Mammoth. Those are pretty controversial, we'll get to those later. But moving down to Group B, we've also got Bliss versus Kanga, as well as Chiefs versus Ground Zero. Now, I know how eager you are to talk about this. Let's talk about Direwolves versus Peace.
Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. I mean, doesn't seem like much of a reward for coming first place in the league.
Yeah, look, Mel, one thing I've always said over the years is that it wouldn't be the LCO without drama. And I think that so Peace, they forfeit their first 5 games because they didn't have a roster, right? And they played 2 games this week and they went 1-1. They were against the top 2 teams, top 3 teams. They were against strong teams. They played against Chiefs and Direwolves, so they're pretty strong, right? And they won one of them, they won lost to them, and so that means that they are sitting in last place, so they're 8th seed, even though they seem to be at least a top 4 team, if not higher, top 3 or even top 2. And so Direwolves, after winning their match, are now placed up against Peace in the first round, which, as you said, it's not much of a reward for coming first. And I was actually not surprised because I think, like most people in the LCO, they do have a bit of integrity, right? But also, at the same time, if it makes sense to lose to have better standings, I feel like, it probably won't happen in LCO, but I'm sure it's happened somewhere, someplace, Like whenever there's an advantage to be gained by losing, something is really, really wrong with the standings.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what you're meant to do as ESL here because there were some tweets last night, I think Praedyth trying to call out ESL about the standings, and there was a bunch of other tweets in the chain saying about how this was talked about several weeks ago after this was kind of, it was realized that Peace were going to be forfeiting games. And it's difficult to know what to do because it's like if you say, okay, Peace, they didn't submit their roster, so they just forfeit all their games. Well, it doesn't make a difference. They still end up in 8th place anyway. You could just take them out of the competition altogether, but then you deprive what is, it looks like a pretty strong team, right? So it's the viewer experience probably suffers as a result and you have a bias. So I feel like that's not really the play either. Another thing you could maybe do is make it so first seed gets first choice of seeds 5 to 8. And then second G gets second choice, third, so forth, to where you can actually pick who you go against. And I actually kind of like that better because a lot of the time the standings, I mean, again, it's sort of hard because you only had 1 round robin, but at least in normally I would say that the standings don't necessarily reflect the team's strengths. Normally it's a little different. So I think that would probably be the best alternative. But can they swap to it now? I'm not too sure because it's changing the rules, right? So I think ESL don't really have a good out here. Like anything they do is going to kind of be bad. It also sucks that there's going to be like a 3-week break now. So that's like 3 weeks where they could run another round robin, right? Because that's how long it took to run this one. So I'm not sure what they're actually doing for the next 3 weeks. Like, are we just taking a vacation here or what? Because we have 3 weeks where we could just play another round and then, Peace wouldn't end up in last place. So, yeah.
Yeah, it does feel like if you want to maintain like pristine competitive integrity or whatever, you have to take Peace out, right? But I feel like what you mentioned before, first place gets first choice, blah, blah, blah. I feel like that is a much better compromise because, ultimately Direwolves should be rewarded for coming first place. And it feels like in this current system, they really are not at all. And I think, especially like bringing up Prey this tweet, the fact that it has to be brought into question because of the situation we're in is just like, it's really bad.
Yeah. And I think ultimately what all this has actually led to is that probably 3 of the top 4 teams are all on one side of the bracket.
Yeah.
And so the other side of the bracket is, I would say, significantly easier
For sure.
than this one. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see which 2 teams, end up even going to the, I guess, what would you call it? Like the upper bracket final is what you call it?
I don't know.
But,
The finals.
Anyway, which one out of Direwolves, Chiefs, and Direwolves, PG, and Peace are going to actually end up qualifying? Because both, I would honestly maybe be expecting, like, given that Chiefs are 4-3 at the moment, that those 3 teams are actually all better than Chiefs potentially right now. And only one of them is going to end up going. So exciting stuff.
Once again, it's time for LCO Moments. Now, last week, we asked you a very important question. And it was, what was it?
I believe the question was, who's your favorite league waifu and why? But what it was disappointing.
That was fucking disgusting. Only one person replied and they quote tweeted it. Shout out JB. But the rest of you are every single you guys are you know what? You know what?
What are you doing?
This is what you missed out on. Ricky, censor it. This is what you missed out on. You could have had all of this. And now you get nothing. So
I think emelg might be moving to Sydney the way he's living rent-free in the LCO caster's head.
We got emelg __. The blood of his enemies is his favorite snack. Understandable. Men's warrior.
MLG.
I stand emelg. We have a 100% win rate in that bottom lane.
Most carbon. My mind is a fortress. Nothing gets to me, especially not emelg.
I think emelg gets to him the most.
You reckon?
Emelg's living in Tim's head rent-free.
Who do we have as number 2? Oh, we got emelg. Make fun of cupboards.
I was going to say as well, with emelg now he's on the screen, I did see him in chat yesterday when we were discussing the Bard players, are they enemies? And emelg said yes. So
What?
thought we were friends. We are now enemies.
yeah, I think Rusty might actually be onto me because, day one, he asked if we both played Bard, are we still enemies? And I said, I typed in Twitch chat, yes, not expecting anyone to see it because, it's Twitch chat. And then day 2, he calls me out. And yeah, I'm a little bit scared for my life now. He's right up there. And he looks happy, but you hate to see Rusty when he's mad.
I'm not happy. They're pissing me off.
Yeah.
I know
don't think
this
it's
is
fair
a
enough at this point.
professional broadcast and we're meant to be neutral and be nice, but for the love of God, play the game to win. Stop having fun and keeping us all here when the game is over.
Next up, we did see this last week, but why not stances? He pulled out the floss thing. Is it the floss or the floss thing?
I think it's flossing.
I'm not.
I'm not up to date with
I'm
the
not up
kids,
to date.
but
I don't play much Fortnite, but in his other win against PGG, there was nothing.
I'd be glad to see it stop.
You and me both, brother. The next day, the LCO cast were demonstrating some of their ways they like to, help prevent tilt, which is a nice segment, very wholesome. But Kitty came along with some, questionable, interesting, potentially ethically dubious methods of her own.
Keep Q until you win. That's the best way to overcome tilt. 100%.
I just go out and touch grass.
Just give me touches grass.
There you.
I smell my cat. You know how cats sleep and they turn into a little ball? I just put my face onto her belly and I
After the Peace victory against Chiefs, we saw the return of an old friend, someone who has more history than a lot of LCO organizations, the Avant gaming chairs.
They'll look good doing it as well. It was a slow start and somehow they still have the Avant chairs. There's no way they still have the Avant chairs. That's just thrown me so bad. Those things are prehistoric.
Urban Oath heritage.
There's no way they still have those chairs.
Unbelievable.
I had those chairs.
I've sat on them, Rusty's sat on them, even the content warlord Giles was tweeting about them. It's a revolutionary piece of Oceanic history.
Well, when all is said and done, no matter how much drama there is, we still have to make our predictions. Let's move into the first match, Direwolves versus Peace. What's your pick?
Well, it's 3 weeks away, so anything we predict is probably going to be wrong and out of date by then anyway. But if I had to predict it right now, I feel like you just predict 2-1 to Direwolves because Peace seems strong. Direwolves, they won their game up against Peace, but it was admittedly like sort of close. But Direwolves seemed a little cleaner, and also I think they picked a comp that was much easier to execute, which I'm a fan of. So I will say 2-1 to Direwolves, but I mean, it's 3 weeks away. Like, who really knows?
It's tough predicting a best of 3 where we only have 2 matches worth of data to go off of for Peace. But I'm also going to go 2-1 Direwolves. I think Peace have shown that they're strong enough to probably take at least 1 game. But ultimately, I don't feel like they're as polished as Direwolves are. I think Direwolves have really I think surprised both of us in how well they've been playing and how consistently, I feel like. So yeah, 2-1 for me.
Just copying my predictions,
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, stay mad.
Okay. So the next series is PGG versus Mammoth, I think it is, right?
Yes.
So
Be more sure of yourself.
we're all expecting a Mammoth 2-0 here.
Yeah, obviously.
All right, moving on. Okay, so next series is Bliss Kanga, right? All right.
Kanga have been very disappointing so far. I think there's no question about that. Obviously, they did pull off their win against Chiefs, which is big in its own right, but I feel like it wasn't without its fair share of mistakes. And I feel like they wouldn't have won that if Chiefs were playing at the level we expected of them. And yeah, this is interesting because it's the sort of like 4th, 5th dilemma we were having at the start of the season when we were making our power rankings. But it really does just feel like Bliss are at a much higher level than Kanga right now. I think that Kanga are still in the stages of like even figuring out their draft identity and how to sort of create a team comp that works for them. Obviously, because the matches are 3 weeks away, a lot could change, patches, whatever. But based on this current state, I would say 2-0 Bliss.
Yeah, I think I have to agree. Even though Kanga's win over the Chiefs could be the sign of like an upward trajectory, like maybe they've kind of got it figured out now, they're feeling confident on stage. It could be all their issues are solved. I think the reality is we just don't really know enough to say if that's the case. So I'll also predict 2-0 Bliss. Hopefully Kanga can kind of show something. Oh look, it was sound reasoning, and I'm a consistent guy.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do hope that the series is closer because I feel like this is one of the ones, I guess one of the 2 out of the 4 that would be the most likely to be close. And I think that Kanga, if they do figure stuff out in these next 3 weeks, they do have a chance.
The last one is Chiefs Ground Zero, I believe.
Indeed it is.
Well, this one, I do believe will be a Chiefs 2-0. It's not like Mammoth, where they're going to destroy PGG. I think this one does go over to the Chiefs. I think Chiefs, they're just too... Of all the top teams, I feel like... Okay, this is weird to say because they just lost to Kanga, but I feel like Chiefs are normally the team that doesn't lose to the teams below them, right? Like, just the way they play is very, very consistent. They just like to play for team fights. They don't normally go for a bunch of crazy stuff. Now, Kanga did just beat them, so my evidence doesn't really back me up here. But I think historically,
trust me, bro.
like Chiefs always do very well against the teams below them. They often have very good match records. And their only losses are against other extremely strong teams. So I don't really see a universe where Chiefs drop a game here.
So you're saying 2-0?
Yeah, 2-0.
Damn, that means our picks are the same because I'm also predicting Chiefs 2-0. I feel like Ground Zero, they've had some signs of life. Sure, they've beat Kang and Mammoth and they're best of ones. But ultimately, I feel like that's not really much to write home about. It doesn't give me much confidence. And I do agree that Chiefs, they do show up when it counts. And I think that this week especially would have been a big wake-up call for them, hopefully. To tweak some stuff and come back in 3 weeks, which is a long time, refreshed and ready to take out Ground Zero. That's all for this episode. Unfortunately, the LCO is going on a 3-week break, but the Matchfix never stops.
The Matchfix might not stop We might do some interim PCS content, but it's not confirmed yet. In the meantime, you will catch emelg and I on twitch.tv/LOL Pacific, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 8 p.m. Sydney time, if you want to watch us cast the PCS. And until then,
We'll catch you next time for your weekly fix.